Welcome to another show of Coffee with Karim. Today I have an esteemed guest, Daniel Hakikachu, also known as the Muslim Skeptic. Daniel, thanks for being on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
So I remember seeing your blog, a few years back, and it really struck me. I'm like, the Muslim Skeptic, what's this about? And at first I thought, is this guy a skeptic towards Islam? Is he skeptical about being Muslim? What exactly? And then I started to, see your topics, the things that you explore, and mashallah, there's a lot of rich, tense topics like, philosophy and science and atheism, down to feminism and liberalism and socio-political movements. And it sounds like, you're kind of taking this position of we have to really be more objective when it comes to these ideas and philosophies, and objective, more importantly, through an Islamic lens. And I kind of get the sense that you get this concern or worry that what you're seeing around you as far as American Muslim communities and the way they participate or validate certain ideas or philosophies is quite concerning for you. Would you say that's true, number one? And number two, tell us more about why you chose the title, The Muslim Skeptic.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm definitely concerned about a lot of the intellectual, social, and cultural trends that I'm seeing in the world at large, and then also specifically with the Muslim community. And so I wanted to be able to address some of these intellectual trends. And so I started writing online, and that became a blog and a Facebook page and so forth. So that was my response. And then as far as what the Muslim skeptic, what that idea means is there's this great quote about modernity and the modern kind of secular, more atheistic world. And it's that the modern world, its defining characteristic is that it's just as dogmatic as any religion or belief system, but it's just oblivious to that dogmatism, right? And so when you have dogmatism, there needs to be some way to critique ideas and to question. And we don't see that kind of questioning and critique aimed at some of the modernistic ideologies that are dominant today. Rather, they're just presumed to be rational and scientific and above critique. But if we actually do critique and dissect and deconstruct some of these ideas, we find that they're not as solid intellectually and rationally as people tend to assume. So, another way to look at it is just like skeptics and critics, atheists will try to undermine Islam or will try to question religious belief. Well, how about we turn the tables? How about we analyze at that same level of skepticism some of the modern ideologies, which are even more dogmatic in certain ways than even religion.
That's very interesting. So, for those of us listening, dogma or dogmatism is not a philosophy that has to do with dogs, the animal. This has a different definition. How would you define dogma?
Sure, someone is dogmatic when they blindly hold on to certain beliefs and are not willing to consider other possibilities. And so it's an irrational mindset to have with regards to one's own beliefs. And Muslims, especially conservative, quote unquote conservative Muslims, are accused of being dogmatic, being blind followers. But when we actually look at the Islamic tradition and we actually look at the Quran itself, we find that no, as Muslims, we should grasp the central core of Islamic belief with the light of reason, with the light of rationality. We accept things based on evidence. When we look at the Islamic tradition itself, it's a very rational, systematic, analytic tradition. And so this idea that faith and reason are opposed or contradictory, that's not what we find in Islam at all. Even going, even when we look at the Quran and when we look at how Islamic scholars throughout the centuries understood what Islamic belief is. Yes, we have to hold on to the central tenets of aqidah, of our faith, but there's also very good reasons that we hold on to those beliefs. Very rationalistic. It's a very rationalistic approach to belief that Islam puts forth.
Right, I got it. Now, that's interesting. So if dogma is this kind of limited mentality or psychology that certain beliefs or constructs about reality is absolutely true, and I'm not willing to budge on that, I'm not willing to be open or flexible, that's, dogma, and that's considered a negative thing for the most part, right? But from some of the writings that you mention, it sounds like it's also possible to be a dogmatic liberal, which is kind of funny because liberalism is this idea of, at least in my understanding, to be more open to philosophical constructs and, cultural relativity and moral relativity. I mean, these are usually branches of the idea of liberalism. So, number one, I would love to hear you talk more about that. Can you be a dogmatic liberal? Why or why not? And number two, okay, so let's say Islam, I agree with you, the Islamic tradition does emphasize reasoning and intellect as part of the process of faith. It's not really about leaps of faith and just kind of denying your own reasoning skills because, most religions, including Islam, believe that reasoning is one of the gifts that the divine gave humanity. But then, some people, when you get to now thinking about, do I really believe in the devil? Do I really believe in angels? Do I really believe in a hereafter and all this stuff? I mean, how could you still be reasonable and believe in some of those ideas which much of the modern world considers, fairy tales, and still be a reasonable believer, so to speak? So the first question was, can you be a dogmatic liberal? And the second one is, how can you maintain the claim of reason and intellect when you do believe in unseen facets of religions, which many modern people would consider ridiculous?
Well, to address the first question, yes, absolutely. Liberalism at its core is dogmatic. And we can see this when we look at the history of liberalism, as well as when we look at some of the ideas. So one thing to clarify is that when we talk about liberalism, when I talk about liberalism, I'm talking about philosophical liberalism, not political liberalism. So there's a difference there. So philosophical liberalism is coming from the philosophical ideas of John Locke, John Stuart Mill. You have other thinkers that originate in Britain and France around the 17th, 18th century, who are talking about this idea of liberty and freedom and equality. And so they're proposing that really the way to understand morality and what human beings should pursue and the way that government should dictate how people live their lives is by maximizing liberty. Mm-hmm. Okay, so this is the central idea of philosophical liberalism, that morality is based on maximizing liberty. And so this idea is shared pretty much by all moral philosophers in the Anglo-European American tradition, moving into the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. And what people don't understand is that philosophical liberalism is big enough so that it encompasses things like communism, Marxism, fascism, capitalism, libertarianism. Like, these are all subsets of this wider philosophical liberalism. Why? Because all of these, there are definitely differences between all of these political and economic ideologies, but they are all take it for granted that maximizing liberty is the name of the game, right? We need, communists also want to maximize people's freedom and increase equality. They just disagree with, for example, libertarians on how best to do that. So it's It's a difference in how to achieve that end. So philosophical liberalism is actually this huge tradition, Western tradition, and it's something that takes a lot of things for granted. It takes a lot of assumptions for granted. One being, okay, well, what is liberty itself,
Yeah.
right? And that's something that people don't often stop to think about. How do we define what makes a person more or less free? And then when you get into the details of what different philosophers wrote about that, you realize that it's a lot of claims. It's a lot of claims about humanity's essential nature, human rights and what inherent human interests are. And those are at their core dogmatic because they're just based on what, certain 18th century philosopher just assumes to be the case and says it's self-evident, right? And claims that these views are self-evident. So yeah, you do find a lot of dogmatism in the philosophy of liberalism, and then also in the attitudes today, like political attitudes, the way that a lot of liberals approach certain discussions, you find them very aggressive and not willing to entertain alternatives. And that can go on in issues of like women's rights, democracy, and can there be alternatives to democratic systems, and so forth and so on. So I'll just leave it there and have you respond to that.
No, thanks a lot. That makes a lot of sense. So what I understood was liberalism is a philosophy based on maximizing liberty, and liberty is the freedom of the human being. And this can be achieved or set out to attain with different methods, like Marxism or capitalism or being a libertarian. These are all different ways to kind of make more liberty exist in the human experience. And what's also interesting about this idea is, as you said, it also makes a lot of assumptions about the human condition, what liberty means, what happiness means, what health means, what a lot of things mean. And of course, this is going to influence politics, science, and as someone who's in the field of psychology and human sciences, I know, firsthand that the models or the assumptions about what is considered healthy or unhealthy, what are mental disorders or not disorders, that's also being defined by this philosophy in politics, although I think at times it appears to be, scientific, or that's the way it's kind of prompted up to be. But the reality is, when you look deeply into a lot of these constructs, it's also assuming a lot of things about the human condition. So it is actually, in a way, a religious worldview when you think about it, right? Because it's giving you meaning about the human condition, its purpose, and what makes it happy and what doesn't, and what's healthy and what's unhealthy. Would you say that's a accurate summary of what you share?
Right. I would say it's definitely a metaphysical worldview, meaning you said it's a religious worldview. They would dispute that. Liberals would dispute that they're propounding religion, but we can still say that it's metaphysical in the sense that, okay, this is based on your beliefs about something that's not necessarily physical, like what is a human being, what counts as a human being, what are essential human interests, like what's good. What I mean by that is like, okay, what is good for a human being? This is something that you can understand, like in terms of, well, does a human being benefit from having unfettered access to casual sex? Is that something that's good for a human being or bad for
Depends
a
on
human
your therapist.
being? Exactly, right? So those, or like, does making a clean break from your parents, if your parents upset you and are causing you some kind of trauma or psychological issue, is it best to just cut them off? Or is another path better? Like, you have different religions and philosophies will give you different answers to that depending on what you accept, and it all goes back to this question of, okay, well, what is essentially in the interest of a human being?
Right. Yeah, and I mean, for me, it seems like all these discussions and discourses, it comes down for me, the essence is we're always trying to find out what is truth, what is good, and what is beautiful. Those are really the pursuits of a lot of civilizations and cultures throughout history, in my perspective. And really, it's just basically claims on what is the truth about reality and certainly the human condition. And this happens to be a worldview, just like you have other worldviews, whether it's Islam or atheism or scientism or anything else. So everybody's basically coming to the table and going, this is what it is. And what's happening, though, is sometimes certain groups who, let's say, have more influence or finance or political power, of course, the tip of the power structure, the top of the pyramid, they're usually the ones that are going to funnel down whatever they deem to be reality. And do you think that's happening to some degree in some societies, and certainly in the United States where we both reside?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that just by virtue of being in Western society, whether that's the US or the UK or Europe generally, you definitely have these institutions of power. You have the university system is a major one. You definitely have national politics and the kinds of laws that are passed, so legal institutions. All of these condition citizens or people who reside in those countries to think a certain way and to understand the world in a certain way. And so even like you have Muslims who are going through grade school, and grade school, public schools in the US have a certain curriculum. They teach certain things, and that material is based on this overarching worldview that's informed by liberalism, it's informed by empiricism, scientism, and all these other ideologies that in no uncertain terms are opposed to a religious worldview and definitely an Islamic worldview. So you can have a Muslim child go through grade school and then be influenced, either explicitly or implicitly, and conditioned into seeing the world in that kind of through that kind of lens. And so it's no surprise that so many Muslims who youngsters in the U.S. have trouble finding Islam as a coherent worldview, find Islam to not be very compelling or relevant. Well, of course, you've been steeped in this goop just by virtue of going to school and being in society, watching TV, being influenced by media. That all these ideas are kind of influencing the mind in very subtle but powerful ways. So we're all subject to it, and we're all influenced by it. And it's just a matter of recognizing that influence so that we can, again, question it, critique it, deconstruct it, and ideally come out with a clearer perception that we can then use to get a deeper appreciation and understanding of Islam.
Got it. Well, okay, but someone might go to your blog and go, well, Daniel, you went to Harvard and Tufts and studied philosophy and physics and whatnot. I mean, you went through the system. How come you came out with all these ideas or beliefs, and how come other people could go through the same institutions and be in a more disconnected place from the tradition or value? Why do you think the way you do today, even though you went through top-notch schools in the West?
Well, that's true. Like, it's definitely had an influence on me, but early on, I realized what the game was and what was happening, because I would read things, just through. I would, go to religious classes. I'd go sit with scholars that were in that area as a college student, and I would be exposed to certain texts, classical texts, and I would read things that just offended me and seemed very foreign and very strange. And I would think, how can
these are Muslim texts?
Yeah, Muslim,
right?
Islamic,
Muslim texts.
Yeah, Islamic texts.
Okay.
And even hadith, right? Hadith or verses of the Quran. And okay, well, this sounds so strange and so offensive, even immoral. Like, how could anyone see the world like this or think that this is right? And so I had that kind of confrontation. It wasn't, alhamdulillah, it didn't reach a crisis point, but it made me pause and reflect. Okay, well, why? How could, for 1400 years, Muslims believe in this? And then thinking about it very rationally, well, is it more likely that 1400 years of Muslims were wrong about this, or were just systematically deluded? Or is it more likely that myself, in this particular cultural context, have been influenced and conditioned so that I am the one who's seeing this stuff as strange? So maybe I'm the one who's mistaken. Maybe I'm the one who is being misled into holding these kinds of immoral views or incorrect views. And when I made that realization, that was just a matter of, okay, well, let's investigate why. Like, how could I have been conditioned in this way? What is influencing that? And so originally I was studying physics at Harvard, and I started studying more philosophy because I wanted to understand, okay, well, what are the roots of these ideas that are being taught in grade school, that are being, pushed in mainstream media and so forth? Let me go investigate that. And so that drove my interest in philosophy. And, I ended up completing a degree in both physics and another major in philosophy. And then I did a master's degree in philosophy as well. And the result of all that investigation, and it's a continuing process because I continue to do research, is that, yeah, you can trace exactly where these ideas come from. You can trace exactly why a typical average American or European finds Islam offensive or incorrect in this way and that way and this way and that way. Well, it's because you've been influenced and conditioned by this particular philosophy. And this particular philosophy, when you actually investigate it, instead of taking it for granted, is full of holes. It's full of problems. It's full of contradictions.
Can you give us an example? Can you give us an example, like a concrete one, where you kind of went through this very process that you're describing and how you had that awakening?
So, for example, we talked about sexuality, right? So, if you look at the idea of sexual autonomy, right? There's this idea where, or let's start from the other side. When some Muslims, young Muslims who aren't really educated about Islam, learn that, for example, zina, adultery, results in or has the punishment in Islamic law of lashing or stoning. Okay, that's something that comes across as
brutal, barbaric,
brutal, exactly, savage. And so it causes for a lot of people a crisis of faith when they find out something like this, because what we've been told and in the modern world is that, look, sex is something that people do all the time, and they should be able to choose their partners freely as long as it's consensual. What harm is there? It's a victimless crime. This is, the idea that we grow up with, and we're told over and over and over again. So if you have that idea of sexual autonomy, then of course something like stoning is going to come across as barbaric. Because from one perspective, or from this particular perspective, it's not even the government's business to regulate, or society's business to regulate or have a say in a person's sex life and how they want to have sex. If it's before marriage, or maybe they're married and they want to cheat, that's perfectly up to a person's individual conscience. And we might disagree, and we might say it's immoral. But how dare we think that the government or social forces at large could intervene in that choice? And so that's the process of thinking. But then we can understand it in a very different way. We can understand. Okay, well, let's look at statistics. Let's look at, okay, children that are raised in single parent households, their likelihood of doing drugs, their likelihood of falling into crime, their likelihood of being unemployed, their likelihood of just being a burden on society and costing society overall, millions and billions of dollars, that likelihood goes way up, according to the statistics and studies, when you have more children being born into single parent households. Okay. And then let's not even talk about the psychological trouble that the child, him or herself, has to go through, right? Children also have rights. Just because, two adults consented to sleep together. Well, what about the child that could potentially be born out of that? And what about his rights? And what about his life and livelihood? And so there's all these costs and all of this harm.
Right.
And so if you think that the law should prevent harm and should protect people's interests, then in that light, then it makes total sense that society at large has a stake in whether two people are sleeping together or not.
So in a sense, it is an issue for government to consider, because the point of government is to protect people and to provide a society that offers the most well-being possible. And what you're saying here is, yeah, well, that includes certain moral and even religious positions. And the fact that we've now kind of thrown all that out, and government decides what's right and what's ethical and what's not, without any kind of religious influence. Although that's also problematic, because, I think even in America we still have a strong Judeo-Christian heritage, at least, to say how much of that is actually being applied is a different matter. But there is that kind of connection. But you're saying, if we're just if government says we have no right to tell people how they should, enjoy or not enjoy their bodies, but yet as a result we're actually causing more societal and economic damage, then this actually should be a government issue. Is that one way to understand it, or a point you're making here?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a government matter. It's a social matter. It's something that everyone has a stake in, and a legal system that doesn't take that into consideration is actually unjust and is actually oppressive and unideal, to say the least. So when we make that comparison, we see, okay, well, in Islam, this is factored in. This consideration is factored in. Sexual relations are regulated, because if and it's procedural, right? So that's something that people don't understand when it comes to the Sharia, and specifically with the hudud. And that's a major topic that we can't really do justice to in this short time. But it's procedural. So there's evidence, there's a court of law, there's a prosecution, someone is either convicted or not. And then, that, so there's a procedure there, but at least it's something that's addressed.
Yeah, but in the media they just show like an uncle who, stabbed his daughter because of an honor killing, right, in some village somewhere, and she had sex out of wedlock, so now we ran her over with our car and everyone's recording it, and it's like, oh yeah, this is your Sharia, right? So it's like, it's also trying to show that having these moral constructs and processes is barbaric from start to end. But you're saying, no, there's actually documentation and evidence of this, especially in Islamic civilizations, that, it wasn't just, grab people and burn them, or chop their heads off or stone them just because, I smelled the possibility of adultery, which sometimes happens in these, more or less educated, ignorant villages, so to speak. But you're saying it's just like any other court process, just like you would have in the United States, in this context of, a society where Islam is integrated more so in the governmental structure, correct?
Right, absolutely. Like, if, according to the Sharia, if a dad harms his daughter because he suspects that she's having sex prior to marriage, he's the one who's liable to be punished according to Islamic law. So I don't think that all of these sensationalized examples in the present day are all outside the bounds of what Islam actually prescribes on these issues. So definitely we can't look to some of these countries and how they're doing things as representative of Sharia. But we have to look at, okay, what is the actual doctrine and what has actually been codified and practiced in Islamic civilization. And that's what we should use as a basis of comparison. But yeah, so that's an example of how I would, on just this one topic, right, sexual morality, go about critiquing and deconstructing some of these ideas. And the thing is that I'm using the same information that's available to everyone. Like when it comes to the statistics on crime rate, drug use, unemployment, when the number of single parent households goes up, that's all very well established research. And even those on the political left will use those statistics to say that, oh, we need to have more abortion, right? Because when we legalize abortion, then people who get pregnant because they're having sex outside of marriage and they don't want to have a child, well, then they have abortion, and we have less of those children in society, and so that helps on all of these economic and societal indicators. And so this was an argument that was made in Freakonomics. If you're familiar with that popular book, they argue that, oh, look, we see such a drop in the crime rate in the 90s. Why is that? Well, it's because abortion, Roe v. Wade, became protected, and then so we just presume that more people had abortions, and that resulted in all of this, this decrease in crime, decrease in drugs, so on and so forth. But you can take that same argument and say, okay, well, you're basically saying that abortion is something that should be legal because it has these benefits. Well, then we can use the same argument. And our argument doesn't depend on killing babies. So it's better in that sense, too.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I mean, it's like, I think, again, it keeps going back to the worldview and how we define what's right, what's wrong, what's moral. And I mean, the starting point is, is sexuality something that should be disciplined? Or, as in Western psychological terms, repressed, because that's considered unhealthy, according to a lot of schools of thought. Like, your sexuality shouldn't be repressed. You should explore it. You should engage with it. It's a natural part of your biology, and so on and so forth. And so already from the starting point, you have a very different philosophical underpinning, which is going to result in a certain behavioral patterns and expectations and societal outcomes. Sure. But let me challenge you on something. Some people might go, well, Daniel, you're kind of essentializing too. You're just assuming that everyone who has sex outside of marriage or who gets pregnant outside of wedlock, their families are always, damaged and distorted and a financial burden on everybody. What would you say to that?
Yeah, well, there's always exceptions, right? But the law is based on generality, right? I'm sure there are, 10-year-olds, 11-year-olds that would be perfectly capable to drive a car, and would be perfectly safe in doing so. But that doesn't mean we base the law on the legal driving age and when you can get a driving permit based on those exceptions, right?
Mm-hmm. No, I get your point. Well, I want to swing back to that. It's a second question, like that we started at the beginning of the conversation. So, all right, let's say I find the Islamic worldview to be, more in harmony with what I consider to be true, good, and beautiful. And what's interesting is even the word iman, which is often translated as faith, it comes from the root word amana, which means to have trust or security in a thing, right? So if for example, I trusted that you were going to show up for our episode today, right? I had trust in you that that was going to happen. And so this idea of iman is almost like, which worldview do I entrust myself more to, right? Whether there is a God or there isn't a God, or this religion or not a religion, or this is right or this isn't right. So in the end of the day, humans are all trusting in someone or something or some school of thought, okay? And there's a difference between being taught what is right versus what I've learned to be right. And sometimes what we're being taught is simply social engineering and whatever institutions of education we happen to go through. But as you described, your early years of becoming a Muslim skeptic, you started to be like, well, hold on a second. Is what I've been taught perhaps inaccurate, or is what I'm learning inaccurate? And then there kind of goes through this synthesis, if you will, and filtering out process of what is my truth, at least, right? So let's say we accept Islam as a worldview, and we find there's a lot of reasonable and logical points for why I made that decision. What about now when you get into things like the unseen? This sometimes is a hard thing for people to believe, or even some Muslims are like, yeah, I believe in God and His Prophet, and we should, do good things, but I don't know about all this other, wacky stuff like, the devil and whispers from Satan and all this stuff. I mean, is this just a matter of ادخلوا في السلم كافة ولا تتبعوا خطوات الشيطان, that you should enter into the religion fully and don't follow the footsteps of Satan? In other words, you have to take the whole picture and not just certain pixels of it? Or do you think that, because the current worldview of science and how we're meant to understand things empirically, and anything that doesn't fall into this methodology, we just consider it to be, false for now, or just inaccessible, so there's no point of talking about it?
Sure. So the thing that I say is, so what's the evidence that we have that as Muslims, what's the evidence for jinn, that jinn exists? How do we prove that?
I was gonna say, I mean, if you've ever experienced, maybe an exorcism, or somebody who quote unquote was possessed by a jinn. I mean, for some people that's a real narrative they have of their lives, but that's just a little side note.
Well, yeah. So that's what I was gonna say is that okay, if you ask me, okay, if a Muslim asks me, okay, what evidence is there for jinn, these demons? Like, do we have any evidence? I'll tell them, okay, are you a Muslim? They say yes, and I say, okay, well, the evidence is in the Quran, right? Allah is telling us about jinn. The Prophet ﷺ is telling us about jinn, that these entities exist, and they have this kind of influence on human beings, and they've had this history, and so on and so forth. We have that. So insofar as you're a Muslim, then that is the evidence. And so there's this idea that, okay, well, belief, this has been my experience. I think a lot of Muslims have had this experience, is that you start, there's, when it comes to belief, there's a kind of ineffable aspect to it. And then there's also a more rational aspect to it, right? Ineffable in the sense that you just believe because you have that sense, like you saw something or you read something. I had converts come to me and say, I read this verse of the Quran, and I just knew that was the truth, right? That was it. It just struck them.
That was it. Yeah, it struck them. Yeah.
I just use the word ineffable, meaning that you can't really rationalize it or put it into terms that it'll be the same for someone else. So there's that aspect, and we should not forget that. We shouldn't have this kind of cold understanding of, okay, what is belief? It's just like a rational proof, like a mathematical proof. No, that's not what the experience of belief really is. But that doesn't mean that isn't part of it. We can look at things more rationally as well, and Muslims can have that reflection. Okay, well, look at the world around us. Like, what is all this order that we see, and how did it all come to be, and where does it from? It didn't create itself. So who created it? And you can go through that kind of reflection, and unfortunately, the kind of scientism that exists in the modern world today sometimes hijacks that process, because people think, oh, well, science has explained it. God is not necessary. And that frustrates me as someone who actually studied physics and at Harvard, and I didn't find those answers. I didn't find a coherent explanation for how the world is the way that it is and why does it have the order that it has. And that's what led me to, want to study philosophy, and specifically the philosophy of science. And those answers don't exist. They're just presumed to exist. So again, this goes back to that dogmatism. But let's put that aside because that's a longer conversation. But if you reflect, if you reflect on, okay, well, look at the world around us, look at the diversity of animals and organic species in the world, and the complexity of the human body and the human cell, and when you really get into that, it's just mind blowing. And then that leads you to, okay, well, this is not all for nothing. There was a creator, there had to be a creator. And then when you have that insight and you come to that conclusion, then you can start investigating, okay, well, what would a creator want of human beings? How would a creator interact with human beings? And then you can kind of go through a process of reflection that will, allow you to consider the different world beliefs. We would think that if the creator were trying to interact with human beings and give us a way to live our lives successfully, because he's benevolent, we would think that, okay, the creator has benevolence. Then which religion, which alleged true religion has been the most successful? Which religion has texts that have been maintained, like revelation that has been maintained and preserved and protected? Which you can have dozens of different considerations. I'm just giving you a small taste, but you can go through that analysis one by one and then come up with, okay, well, this most likely this is the right one. Islam is the right one. And then once you do that, and once you get to a place where you accept Islam, then that's just the beginning of belief, right? That's the lowest level, and then you start practicing, and then through the practice of Islam, other things are revealed to you, right? And this is something that scholars say very clearly, that when you, and even in Hadith, the Prophet ﷺ says that when you move toward Allah, when you walk towards Allah, Allah runs to you, right? And so things start becoming more clear, are gaining this insight, this basira, and so on and so forth. And so other things are solidify that faith. And I don't call it subjective. I think that it's very as objective and real as anything else. It's not just something in your mind. It's something that's coming to a person. And Allah says that He solidifies faith and gives certain people yaqeen, and we know about the awliya and on and on. So that's why I'm saying that you can get to the doorstep of faith, of iman, and then when you walk through, then that's a whole other world. And then when you're in that world, and you start conditioning yourself through practice of the deen, then certain things become unquestionable. Because again, there's yaqeen, right? And your faith in the Quran. And so when you read about jinn, then that's like, okay, this is what Allah has told me. So what other evidence do I need? I mean, there are other evidences as well. I'm not denying that. Yeah, there are trained psychiatrists who testify and say that, yeah, I witnessed an exorcism, and there's no psychological explanation for what this possessed.
It's not schizophrenia.
Yeah,
it's not schizophrenia. It's a whole other presence or energy.
Right, exactly. And then in faith, like, you have jinn stories, right? And it's kind of like funny cliche. Oh yeah, the jinn stories. But no, there are things that happen to people, and there is a reality to sihr, right? And people have seen these things, and so that's just another layer of evidence and evidential reasoning. But all of that combined, is what gives a Muslim iman and faith in, what other people who are outside of that paradigm, who haven't, whether they're obstinate or they're just lazy or they're arrogant, they haven't gone through the evidentiary steps and the reasoning, think is just superstition, right? Oh, just ghost stories, jinn, and oh, angels and whatever. We don't care about that stuff. So that's just the brief answer to that line of
No, I
questioning.
really appreciate your response. I think it was well put. So this kind of connects now to this article that you wrote recently in February on I think it was MuslimMatters.com, and it was connected to some of this Pew Research and this other article.
Oh, the article that was about Jewish Americans was called "How Liberalism Destroyed the American Jew."
Right, right. And that was connected to some Pew Research that was trying to show how the Jewish community is becoming less and less religious in actuality, and considering identity of being Jewish to connect to other things, which were I guess the article was trying to show it reflecting more of liberalism and secular ideas, which is very interesting because it's kind of like, I've met secular Jews, I've met secular Christians, I've even met secular Muslims, and I always found that really interesting because it's like you're using a religious term yet a non-religious term to define oneself, and it's like saying I'm a meat-eating vegan. Is that really possible? And why don't you tell us more about the highlights of why you wrote this article, and maybe share with us some interesting stats that we should be aware of? Because I know one thing that came up for me when I was reading these articles and checking out the Pew Research, what came to mind was the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ when he gave us advice or warning that, we're, as a Muslim community, we're going to follow the religious communities that went before us, the Jewish and the Christian community specifically, and especially in matters of our evolution, if you will, and even the mistakes that we might make or the holes that we're going to fall into. And I'm wondering if that came up for you too when you were reading these articles and putting together your response.
Yeah, definitely. That hadith absolutely came to mind about following the Christians and Jews even into a lizard hole. So the thing that really struck me is that you have this article, and it's using Pew Research data, talking about how liberalism destroyed the American Jew, which is pretty stark. And it's written by a Jewish American, and he cites all kinds of rabbis and different Jewish leaders in writing this op-ed. But he cites this Pew Research where they asked Jewish Americans, what does it mean to be Jewish? And the responses were pretty stark, I thought, looking at it from a Muslim perspective, because you see things like, okay, number one on the list on what is an essential part of being Jewish is, number one is remembering the Holocaust. Okay, so that's one thing. Then the second is like leading an ethical and moral life. Working for justice and equality is third. And then like caring about Israel is right there at the top. Having a good sense of humor. And then way at the bottom is observing Jewish law, right? Yeah, so which is interesting because it's like, okay, is Jewish law something that is separate from leading an ethical and moral life? Is observing Jewish law something that's separate from justice and equality? You would think that no, they would be, from a Jewish perspective, those things are intertwined. But no, there's like a big gap there, and Jewish law falls very low on the list when it comes to what it means to be a Jew. And so this is alarming. I mean, just thinking about the Muslim community, because we see similar disassociation from Sharia on the one hand, and then justice, equality, fairness, and so forth on the other hand. And all of that, when it comes to justice, equality, being ethical, that the author of this article, and I think he makes a good point, is that all of that is just based on the larger culture of liberalism, because liberalism is the dominant moral theory, as we discussed, and then if you're part of a culture, if you're part of that culture, and you are trying to fit in and assimilate and be involved in these different institutions, then you kind of have to, you start taking on that conception of what it means to be a just person, and a good person, an ethical person. And so that's very disturbing, because if Jewish Americans have gone through that process over the generations that they've been in the US, then Muslims are going to most likely follow suit. And we're seeing that as we speak. And there was a recent Pew poll done that was published just last month, looking at Muslim Americans. And the result was that Muslim Americans are now more liberal than ever before. And they quantified that in different ways. But okay, well, that tells me, maybe someone else will have a different understanding, but that tells me that, okay, we're following essentially the same path. And what I pointed out in this article is that what is it that drove Jewish Americans to assimilate at a faster rate than they might have otherwise? And from my research, what became apparent is that there's definitely fear that was a driving force. Being afraid because of World War II and what happened to the Jews by the Nazis in Europe. Those in America, there was a sensitivity that, okay, never again. This is not going to happen to us again. And so that fear will lead a community to not stick out and to want to not be the other. And so that makes a community want to adopt a lot of the practices and beliefs and outlook and political language, moral language of the wider society.
Wow. So wait, are you perhaps suggesting that on the data there, the number one of the most important facets of being Jewish, according to that Pew study, was, I think it was about 70% said, remembering the Holocaust, right? Because this was, of course, a horrific collective trauma that was done to a religious community. And you think that this, because it's one of the foundational values of many people who identify as Jewish today, this is connected to what you're discussing here, the fear factor, and that if we remain other or distinguish ourselves too much, we run the risk of being targeted or victimized by the greater societies. And you think that there may be a connection here?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it is that fear factor that, and the thing about the fear is that not all fear is justified, right? Because you can be, if you fall into a victim mentality, and here I'm not talking about Jewish Americans, I'm just talking about the Muslim community. When Donald Trump was elected, there were a lot of people in the Muslim community saying that, oh, we're in a pre-genocidal moment, meaning that, oh, wow, Muslim Americans are on the brink of genocide. And I thought that was definitely an exaggeration and a kind of victim mentality. And I'm not saying that Donald Trump wasn't a threat to the Muslim American community.
Is a threat.
Is a threat. Yeah, he's still in office, unfortunately. But I didn't think it warranted his election. I don't think warranted this fear that, okay, we're all going to be thrown into gas chambers. But that's the rhetoric that is being spewed to the Muslim community. And so what is the effect of that? That has an effect. It will make Muslims not want to, dress a certain way that conflicts with kind of the dominant cultural modes of dress. It will make Muslims not want to talk a certain way or think a certain way or behave a certain way. And so there's this conditioning that's created by this hyper fear that is just self-generated, right? It's based on external factors, right? But it's just dialed up to an unreasonable degree. And so that's the kind of thing that I was highlighting in that article, and I still think is an issue with Muslims just over-exaggerating what's actually happening in the world.
Yeah. I mean, I would like to add that probably other religious communities, especially our Jewish and our Jewish brothers and sisters, they probably feel the same way right now. I mean, there's also anti-Semitism happening towards them as well. It's not just the Muslims, and probably anyone who is an Anglo-Saxon Protestant might feel a little uncomfortable right now, especially if their mode of life can distinguish them, whether it's in dress or what community centers they visit or how they, think or interact. I mean, it seems like everybody is feeling sensitive right now, whether, you're a religious or racial or ethnic minority.
Right, absolutely. I think there are differences, though, in the way that different communities respond. I think that if we look at Black Americans, their response has marked differences with how Muslims, and I know there are a lot of, about over or nearly a third of the American Muslim population is Black. But if you look at the Black community overall, Muslims and non-Muslims, their response hasn't been to just kind of blend in. Their response hasn't been, okay, we have to kind of get rid of or dial down our views and our beliefs and kind of blend in. That hasn't been their response. Their response has been, no, this is who we are, and we're not going to be intimidated to just change and to kind of self-censor ourselves. And I wish that the larger Muslim community would learn some lessons from this, that you can be, we have the opportunity to be ourselves and to live according to our principles and to advocate according to our principles. So why don't we do that? There's no reason for us to just hide in a hole out of fear. It's just not justified.
Well, let me ask you this. How do you know that the majority of Muslims in America are having this response of the fear factor and hiding in a hole, or let's shed more religious and layers that we have because we are afraid? I mean, how do you know that that's even the trend? And how have you observed that? Is this from your own interaction with community and kind of people commenting on posts that you write? I mean, what's your evidence?
Well, yeah, definitely. From my personal experience, what I've seen, people who have approached me, like when it comes to my Facebook page and my website, I try to be as genuine as possible and to not shy away from positions that are well established in Islam, but are politically incorrect today in the Western context. And so, I try to be very clear on, okay, this is what Islam holds, and as a Muslim, this is what I hold. And people have told me that, oh, well, you shouldn't really address this issue. You shouldn't really talk about this issue. It's not necessary because look at the political environment. We need to just lie low right now. We shouldn't rock the boat. It's dangerous. We're about to be thrown into concentration camps, yada, yada, yada. And basically telling me to censor myself. And I find that, very counterproductive, to say the least, and dangerous at worst, because I'll give you an example, like on the issue of same-sex marriage. So this is a complicated issue. Again, we can't really do justice to it in this short time. But, when it comes to promoting or supporting same-sex marriage, I can't see how a Muslim could support same-sex marriage. And there are a lot of arguments that, okay, we know that Islamically it's immoral, same-sex intimacy is immoral, but we can still support it politically because, we live in the United States, it's a non-Muslim country, we can still support that politically. But I really don't buy that argument, and there's a lot of reasons why. And I wrote an article about it for MuslimMatters.org. But without getting into all the arguments, the basic point is that, look, this is something that is immoral. We believe is immoral. We maintain that it's immoral from our tradition. So how can we support it politically? Other groups come to the political table with what they think is right or wrong. You have, feminists, for example, left-wing feminists coming to the political arena saying that, look, we think that women should have the right to abort, And we don't think there's anything wrong with that. In fact, we think that's great. We think it's liberating. And so that's their belief. They're coming to the table and advocating for that.
If other groups are coming and saying we are going to stick with our principles and values, but you feel that the Muslims may not be very solid in that, like who's choosing and deciding what's important and what we should support and what we shouldn't? I mean, is this coming from just Muslim celebrities out there, organizations? I mean, it doesn't seem like there's a cohesive central unit that the Muslim community, at least in America, is deciding how to interact with what's going on around us. It seems like every community has their own approach, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very reactionary. It's very reactionary and unprincipled. And when you act in an unprincipled way, then it's very easy to trip up and to contradict yourself and to fall into all kinds of problems. And the problems I'm talking about is not like political problems, because that's really the least of our worries, is the political situation. What we need to be worried about is the next generation of Muslims and what we're teaching the next generation of Muslims. If you look at the statistics, again, going back to the example of homosexuality, you have more than 50% of American Muslims who think that there's nothing immoral about homosexuality. That's another research result that's come out in the past few years. Support for same-sex marriage is definitely more than 50% in the American Muslim community. And so the question is, are our values regarding sexuality being communicated to this young generation? And what is the community going to believe, in 50 years, in 20 years, right? Things are changing. And so the religion is not being, and it's a domino effect, because then the next generation is going to be even worse and so forth. So then is Islam even going to be around in America in any kind of recognizable form within 2 or 3 generations? I think that's a very real question, and it's more important than, are we going to have, are we going to get invited to the White House this year or something like that?
Right. Well, it's also possible that, a lot of this research that you're referring to here, the 50% Muslims who accept homosexuality as okay. Also the question is, are these what we call, are they cultural Muslims? Or are they really, devout Muslims, so to speak, right? Because we know that there's, just like the other religious communities, you have people that are like, yeah, I'm Muslim, but, there's nothing really Islamic about them, so to speak. And for me, the difference is, there is cultural Muslims, the religion is just part of my cultural identity. But it kind of stops there, versus, somebody who really is trying to live an Islamic identity. It's a lot more existential for them. At least that's how I like to frame it, right? This is my existentialism. It's not just like my cultural facet, because, one thing that I notice is, these Muslim comedians, celebrities, actors, musicians, it's like Muslims are getting a little excited about, like, yeah, we're hitting the mainstream, and like we have a show on Netflix, it's a Muslim guy and comedian and this and that. And then I go and I see these things and I'm like, there's, nothing really Islamic about them. But like one show, I remember seeing an episode that someone told me I should check out. And basically the whole show was about avoiding prayer, and finally telling his parents that he eats pork and he doesn't care, and that him and his cousin, go out drinking, and they convince each other to lie to their parents to miss Eid prayer so they can go to a barbecue and eat pork. Like that was the story of the show. And I'm like, are we really proud of that? The only way you can really be a true American is if you could just get rid of all your Muslim stuff. But if you want to keep the cultural stuff, like, jokes about immigrants and the food you eat and the color of your skin, that's cool. That's tolerable. But when you start actually showing any conviction in the Islamic tradition, you don't get that. And I've seen this happen. A lot of comedians and stuff, they're like, oh, I'm not religious, I drink, I'm this, and they just put it right out there. They want everyone to know I'm not Islamic, but I just happen to be connected to this Muslim community. Do you think that's also kind of a reflection of some of the data here that you're discussing and showing concern for?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot that can be said about this. I mean, it goes back also to our earlier point about dogmatism, because as you mentioned, there is tolerance for certain superficial, or from our perspective, superficial things like, oh, what you eat, or different kind of cultural aspects of South Asia or the Arab world. But there's no ideology tolerance. There's no like belief tolerance. And if anyone who has worked in the corporate world in the West knows, is that if you don't drink, you're at a big disadvantage in the corporate culture. Even if and depending on certain views that you have, like if you think that, okay, yeah, I think that homosexual behavior is sinful or immoral, that's also like, you can't express that. You can't say that out loud. Or even if people find out about you that that's what you think, then your career is in jeopardy in the corporate world, and definitely at the Fortune 500 companies. Like, you can't express that. And so there's this, and even talking about God, like coming out and saying, okay, I'm a believer. I believe that there's heaven and hell, and there's God that will judge us, and this is the Quran and things like that. That's taboo. And so there's no tolerance or openness about those aspects of what makes us who we are. But okay, yeah, we'll have like shawarma night at the office to honor this, Arab culture. So yeah, it goes to back to the question of dogmatism, and not realizing that you're being dogmatic and oppressive and intolerant. But then also, when you have people like these comedians who claim that they're culturally Muslim, and there is this larger idea that, okay, a Muslim just is whoever considers himself Muslim, then that's what a Muslim is. That's how we define Muslim. I think that's very problematic, because there are theological requirements for being Muslim.
Right. Like being a vegan. Like there are tenets to being a vegan. You can't just make up your own veganism. Like nobody would accept that I eat meat, but I'm also a vegan necessarily.
Exactly.
Like that's just it's like actually that goes against the very idea, right? Just like being an atheist Muslim, it's like Muslim is to submit yourself to God. So how can you be an atheist Muslim? So at that point, they're just talking about a cultural heritage or connection here. But do you think they should just remove the word Muslim completely from their sense of identity in that case? I mean, is that your position, or do you think, because some people go, no, you can't say that. Only Allah knows, and if someone claims they're Muslim, then who are you to say they're not? Right? But I mean, how would that even be addressed? And are we using Islamic tradition to define what is Muslim? Like, are there real conditions or pillars here that would define somebody as a Muslim in Islamic law, or that's not even stipulated?
Well, I think that's where the conflict really lies, is that it's really a struggle for defining these terms. And you have people who want to redefine Muslim and kind of divorce it from all theological implications. And that's what happened with Jew. The Jewish identity, according to some statistics, about 50% of Jews don't believe in God, right? And you do have Jewish atheists. I mean, that's an established group within the Jewish community. And so there has been this transformation over time, over centuries. If we look at Jewish history, of the term Jew being defined into more of an ethnicity. And then the same thing is happening with Muslim as a term. And we should resist that, and we should speak out against that, and not just concede that, oh, yeah, whoever wants to define the term however they want, they can do so. No, like I think the vegan example is perfectly apt. Like, I think vegans as a community would be very upset if veganism became associated with meat eating, and or even unethical farming practices. Like, what if some of these big farming agricultural industries started appropriating the term vegan, and said, oh yeah, we're completely vegan compliant, and they're like doing all these kinds of despicable things to their farm animals. I think there'd be moral outrage on the part of vegans, that their term has been hijacked. And I think Muslims need to have that same sense of ghaira and jealousy, to translate, of their religious terms. It's not just up for grabs. Whoever wants to define however they want. No, we're going to defend the correct meaning of Muslim. And yeah, I think that's what our orientation should be on that question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, in a sense, it's almost like you're strengthening at least from my understanding, the classical argument in Islamic doctrine and literature that, there is a true perception of actual reality. And the manuals or guidance that comes from the divine is meant to guide us and help us see things for what they truly are. And the point of the path is to refine oneself, to align and be in harmony with how things have been set up, right? And if we don't hold this position, then of course it's going to be a free-for-all. Of course it's whoever wants to define and whoever has the most influence and the most media, propaganda, marketing, whatever you want to call it. But is that the position that you're kind of coming from? Like, no, there is an actual truth that's established. Sure, interpretive efforts and adjustments are always part of an evolving intellectual community, but there are things that are khalas, they're in place. Like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala set the balance, He set the harmony, and He tells us don't transgress the balance. So what would God be referring to if there's nothing already established, if everything is just a matter of, relativity and evolving and so on and so forth? Is that kind of where you're coming from, and what prompts you to run with the mission and objectives that you have?
Absolutely. I think that, this idea of relativism and subjectivism is definitely a disease that a lot of Muslims these days are suffering from. And they think that, Islam doesn't have an established clergy. There's no authority to tell us what the Quran definitively means and what the Prophet ﷺ definitively meant. And it's all up in the air, so we can just co-opt the terms however we want according to our personal interpretation. And this kind of subjectivism is coming, again, from Western philosophy. And if you look at the philosophy itself, again, it's full of holes and it's incoherent for many reasons that we can get into. So when we look at something like scientific interpretation, like you have a particle accelerator and it reads out certain data, you have to have the required knowledge to be able to interpret what that data says. And there can be professional disagreement among scientists, and there might be 2 or 3 valid opinions that come out of interpreting that data, but it's not a free-for-all. It's not anyone, a guy off the street who can, barely do basic arithmetic is going to be reading particle accelerator data and interpreting it. And trying to understand what it means. So the same thing with religious texts, with the Quran and with our tradition, is that, it is open. People can interpret it based on their scholarly view, but you have to be a scholar. You have to have the credentials. And it's very merit-based, actually, in Islam, as opposed to other traditions. Like, you don't have to go to a centralized authority. You just have to study the text and be certified by other people who know what they're doing and what they're talking about, and who have gone through that same path, to say that, okay, yes, you have permission to teach on this subject. You have the permission to interpret and do tafsir. You have the permission to do that. So it's very rational. It's very merit-based, and it's not just all a free-for-all where anyone can come in with their 2-bit opinion just because they have a degree from, like BU or Brandeis or Harvard even, because they've taken a class, or maybe they even have a PhD and they have a degree. Now they're, quote-unquote, a scholar of Islam.
Right. Which, I mean, even the Quran says, when you don't know something, ask those who know. And this is true for, if I go do a medical diagnosis report and am I going to ask my wife to analyze that? if she has no medical background? It makes no sense, right? Or if I'm going to take my car to a butcher and say, hey, can you fix my car? I mean, you always go to special people that specialize in the very subject matter that you're looking for answers or guidance or healing in, right? And Islam is no different, and I think every religious tradition is the same way. I mean, I've sat with teachers of other religious doctrines, and they have the same idea, right? That there is a established tradition, there are scholars, there's a hierarchy of knowledge, and I've experienced this with masters of Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam alike. So it's a good
and beyond.
point.
I mean, that's why I was saying with science, it's not just religion; it's even the scientific disciplines, which, from a secular perspective, are the peak of knowledge, right? Is what scientists are doing in their labs. And even in that context, you have a hierarchy of knowledge, you have experts, and it's not just a subjective exercise on how you feel about certain things determines truth.
Right. Feelings aren't always facts. But okay, let me ask you this. So we know that in the Sunnah, the Prophet ﷺ told us that at the end of time, you're going to have people come out as the knowledgeable ones when in fact they're not. And the actual knowledgeable people won't be considered, the knowledgeable ones. So there's that issue. And number two, how would you define what is a real Muslim scholar? Or how do we know how to identify them, in your opinion? Because there are people that have that issue. It's like, okay, who should I learn from? Because this guy says something, this guy says something else, this woman says something else. How do I know who's really speaking the truth here?
Yeah, I mean, this is a big question. And there are hadith that speak to coming time where there'll just be so much confusion amongst Muslims and there won't be a way.
So yeah, please share with us the hadith.
Okay, so the Prophet ﷺ said, he was talking about Dajjal, the Antichrist. And so the Prophet ﷺ said that let him who hears of the Antichrist go far from him. For I swear by Allah that a man will come to him, meaning to the Antichrist, thinking that he's a believer, and then you'll follow him because of shubahat, roused in him by him. So this idea of shubahat, or ambiguous matters, confused matters, questions, these are something that definitely exists in our time. There's plenty of shubahat that people are suffering from. And there aren't often clear answers. So the question is, who do you trust? Who can you really rely on? And I think the only way to really gauge that in this time is how conformant a particular scholar is with the scholarly tradition. And because we have established positions, we have positions that have all of this support among the schools of thought, the madhahib, and that should be our criteria for determining how close to the truth a particular scholar is in this day and age. And it's a very rational reason for this, is because the level of knowledge that we have today really pales in comparison when we look at the giants of Islamic scholarship in the past. There's no comparison between the level of knowledge that someone like Imam Ahmad or Abu Hanifa or Imam Shafi'i or Malik have, or even scholars that were relatively less than them in our history, compared to anyone today. Even the most knowledgeable scholars of today really pale in comparison just by their grasp of the material, grasp of the nusus, the source text, and their ability to derive rulings and their understanding. And that's a fact that's plainly acknowledged, right, by scholars today, by the most knowledgeable scholars today. So given that relative level of knowledge, if the level of knowledge was the same today as it was even 500 years ago, then okay, then you might have opinions that diverge from based on different circumstances today, opinions that diverge from the scholarly consensus or from the schools of thought. But given that the level of knowledge is so lacking in comparison, it's just safer, and more rational, if you want to stay safe and you want to preserve your deen, because this is not like a light issue, right? If you follow a scholar who is misguiding you, you're still held accountable for that, and you'll stand before Allah on Yawm al-Qiyamah and be asked about that. So this is not a light issue. You have to be careful and you have to be cautious. And again, like this hadith about Dajjal and being able to confuse people who consider themselves to be believers. And they might be believers, but then they go and are confused. And so how does that happen, right? How can someone change in such a dramatic way? And so we have to be very hyper careful, sensitive, and cautious, given what we know about these times that we're in. And so the criteria that I have that I think makes most sense is, okay, let's compare and see if there's a view that diverges significantly from what the scholarly precedent has been. Because in theory, Imam Malik or Imam Ahmad, they're not infallible. The scholars of those madhahib are not infallible. They do their ijtihad, they could have made a mistake. In theory, someone else can have a different ijtihad from those four. So there's no denying that. But is that something that's feasible? Like, do I have more confidence in the ijtihad of the Hanbali school or the Maliki school, or some modern scholar today who who knows if he or she even has usul to begin with, and maybe that usul, even if they have it, is completely baseless and incoherent. And so it's just a rational line of thinking as far as I'm concerned. Right.
Sounds like we're holding on to hot coals in these times, huh? And there's also the other end of it too. Not only like I'm enamored by a certain scholar and I think that, mashallah, I'm investing my salvation in them and I want to learn from them and so on and so forth. And they may actually be a good person, a good scholar, but like you said, they don't necessarily have the depth and the grasp of all these different disciplines. They're not polymaths in the same way that, some of our classical scholars were. And you also have, on the other hand, the kind of local imam who, from my humble experiences, especially the, immigrant imams that come and haven't had a lot of education beyond what they learned back home, they're also a whole other form of misguidance, in my opinion, almost like unhealthy dogmatic Islamic orthodoxy or cultural Islam. And you also find this on the other end too, right? Where people are like, no, Islam's the right way. But then the version of Islam that they're teaching also goes against a lot of rational or intellectual principles of the religion itself.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there is ignorance. And right now, with the internet being available, it's a curse and it's also a blessing. The blessing is that you can compare and contrast people from all over the world. And so if someone is, in the past, you might have not had any opportunity to learn from anyone other than the local imam. But now that's not the case. There is no excuse. If you learn something from your local imam that doesn't feel right, then you can investigate. You can consult with another mufti. Like there's email, right? There's cell phone technology. You can verify. And so there needs to be this sense of due diligence when it comes to religious matters. And unfortunately, I don't see a lot of that nowadays, but hopefully we can revive it so that Muslims, there's this understanding of an intelligent consumer, right? And I don't want to make it seem like Islam is a product, but the idea of being intelligent about how we take our deen, it's very relevant, and we need to be intelligent about it.
Right. So I'm hearing you say you certainly feel that all Muslims have a responsibility to seek knowledge and to verify things. This whole, I'm just going to follow someone blindly or invest my salvation in another person's ideas and guidance, that's not going to go far existentially, especially when we consider divine accountability. right? Are you really going to be comfortable meeting Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and saying, well, that's what my shaykh said, or that's what my imam said? But I've also heard other, even mashayikh, say, hey, this is why you should follow a madhab, because if you're following the doctrine of a madhab, there's this idea of almost like the sheikh of the madhab will be taking responsibility for the mistakes that you did because you're following his school of thought, for instance. Have you ever heard this argument or this reflection?
Yeah, but that counsel is based on if it's it's a school of thought, it's like it has the credentials to be followed in that way. So there's definitely taqleed as a very important concept because me or you or the average, Muslim on the street is not going to have the time or the resources to be able to derive and do his own ijtihad to understand, okay, what is the absolute correct position on this or that issue. But when it comes to trying to find a scholar to follow, there are indications that will allow you to judge that, whether such a person is worth following. And the biggest indication in my book is that, okay, this person is in line with the schools of thought, the madhahib, because you have people today, very prominent people, scholars, whether they're real ulama or not, who will say, oh, well, this is what all the madhahib held on this issue, and I have a different view, or I have a different position. And that makes me feel very uncomfortable, and that should make Muslims feel very uncomfortable that, oh, okay, maybe this is not the best person to trust, right? Going back to the question of trust with my deen. But the issue of taqleed, I think, is very important nonetheless. And after you have identified those scholars that are on the sunnah and are true carriers of the tradition, then yes, at that point, it's good to follow them and to do taqleed on those issues that relate to a person's faith.
Mm-hmm. But okay, let me ask you this. So if I say, I follow an opinion that is different from the four madhahib, in some cases, it may just be my shahawat, right? My own desire or my own position. I may even sincerely believe that, right? And now, are there also times where maybe these new positions that have been formulated on certain matters actually need to change, or there's more evidence to show that this position needs to be re-examined or reformed, so to speak? I know that it depends on what we're talking about, but is that also possible? Because some people might hear what you're saying and go, okay, so our religion is now crystallized in, the 10th century or 7th century. So where is the whole idea of ijtihad and evolution of thought and interpretive efforts to constantly extract the truth and practice it as best as we can, provided our existential realities? I mean, on the one hand, is it crystallized? And on the other hand, how much room is there for flexibility and quote-unquote reform or reinterpretive efforts to produce different positions on matters?
Well, my question to that is, how much has the world changed since the 10th century or the first century of Islam? Like, how much change has there been? If you're talking about new technology, there might be certain technological questions, like, okay, if I email a non-mahram, is that khalwa, right? Is that cyber khalwa, right? You can have questions like that are based on modern technology, but that's a case where ijtihad would have to be used, but it's still based on the usul, the principles of the schools of thought that have been established already. And so this idea of crystallization or the gates of ijtihad have been closed, I think that confuses people because the principles are alive and well, and the principles are what lead to the ability to give fatwa on new circumstances because of technology or because of something that is genuinely unprecedented. But you have people who are saying, oh, well, we live in new times and new culture, and now people think that same-sex intimacy is about love, before it was about lust, but that's the past, and now we live in a time where it's about love. So we need to change, the prohibition against these acts. And so that, I think that's completely baseless, and it makes no sense. Like, the essential activity hasn't changed. Like, there hasn't been anything new. It's the same thing. Like, it's the same act. It's the same behavior. And from another perspective, the same desire. It's the same human beings who are engaged in that. And so, yes, the rulings from the past are just as applicable from the beginning of Islam until today. But yeah, if there's something that's genuinely new, genuinely unprecedented, okay, then we can talk about those on a case-by-case basis, and whether it's actually the case that nothing within the usul of the established madhahib is applicable to that particular case. Like, if you find something like that, then I'd be happy, to consider that example.
Right. No, I think that's a good response. I mean, I'm hearing you say, listen, the principles and the methods of coming to new conclusions based on new existential realities is already there. It's just a matter of harnessing that for the purposes to be. And like this homosexuality example, on the one hand, it's like, okay, let's just align ourselves with the liberal philosophy of the times. And then sometimes you find a bounce from that where people get more barbaric and dogmatic in how, horrible and wrong it is, and how you should be stoned, and all this nonsense. And, Islam's always trying to bring us somewhere to the middle. And so as someone who, for example, is in the field of human science and these types of things, I mean, it's like, okay, why don't we have Muslim psychologists who are doing more research on sexuality and the influence of environment, genetics, and psychology on a person's sexuality, intimacy issues, emotional capacities, and all these other variables that have a lot to do with a person's sexuality and desires in the first place. It's almost like we can't live in a black and white world. And everything has to be assessed and understood on its own terms. But also, if we're really trying to sincerely find the truth, we have to put some effort into discovering that truth, right? We can't just either resort to something from way back then or just accept everything today without giving it further thought. And I think perhaps that's one of the things that frustrates you, at least from my observation in some of your writings. Would you say that's accurate?
Yeah, I think that's accurate. I think that when we want to pursue the truth, there has to be methodology. There has to be guidelines, and the guidelines need to be accessible to people generally, because otherwise you're denying the possibility of everyone arriving at the truth. And as far as religion is concerned, as far as Islam is concerned, the understanding is that, yeah, it is something that everyone has the ability to come across and to investigate and to ultimately believe in. And that's the responsibility, that's the amana that humanity has. And Allah holds us accountable for that. So, yeah, we need to have guidelines and principles. And the problem with what a lot of people say in the modern period is that, when it comes to religious claims, there are no guidelines. It's just a free-for-all. There are no standards. The standards that people claim to have, that's just based on power. It's just based on an irrational patriarchy or what have you. And so we don't need to abide by that. And my response to that is to say, well, no, even from a rational perspective, if you start from the beginning, you will come to the conclusion that, okay, yes, these great scholars of the past were great. They were scholars. They were more intelligent. They were more rational than we are. And I think that's an honest assessment that any person can make, even if you're skeptical. And you see that amongst some Orientalists. Some Orientalist thinkers will say that, look, we have a great respect for the Islamic tradition because look at the level of knowledge and look at the level of depth of thought. You have like someone like Wael Halak, who's a very prominent academic who is Christian. He's Christian Palestinian. And the way that he talks about Islam and Islamic law, you'd think that he's a Muslim, because he talks about with such respect and reverence, because he's seen, like, he wasn't a Muslim, he didn't come from a Muslim background, but just because of his scholarly or his academic investigation and reading these texts and seeing what was written, he was amazed by that and came to see it as, yeah, these guys know what they're talking about. This is, and modernists who are kind of trying to subvert that are kind of, it's amateur hour. Like, that's his assessment. Like, that's how he'll describe it, not even be a Muslim. So I think that's very telling. But yeah, I think we definitely need to be committed to investigating the truth, but we should also respect those who have gone before us and who have gone through that process. And the more knowledgeable we are, the more able we are to see that level of scholarship. And the more ignorant we are, the less likely we're to see the superiority of that level of rationality and intellect.
Right. Yeah, and from my experience working with hundreds of Muslims from all backgrounds with different stories, one of the common themes I find with a lot of people is a lack of what I would consider a decent Islamic education. I mean, I'm no scholar by any means, but stuff that I would even consider common sense or min al-ma'ruf, what is universally known in the Islamic tradition. It's some people that they don't even know about it, right? And on the other hand, I know that most Muslims, Daniel, I mean, let's be honest, they're not going to necessarily be super passionate and academic in their investigation and take the time to learn, about these different madhahib or learn Arabic and translate. I mean, most people aren't going to do that, right? So what would be your advice to the everyday Muslim who maybe is affected by your message here and wants to do something about their path and knowledge, but they don't necessarily have the bandwidth or they don't know where to start? What would be some tips that you would leave our audience who could brush up on what they need to know or what's important for them to know, and that going to Friday Jum'ah prayer is not enough to say, I learn Islam, right, from a 45-minute khutbah every week. That's not necessarily considered an actual Islamic education.
Yeah, there are a lot of online resources. So different people need different things. But as far as just understanding the basics and knowing the basics of Islam is something that's fard, right? It's required to know what is required of oneself as a Muslim, what is required in terms of practice, what's required in terms of belief, like what are the pillars of belief. People generally know the pillars of Islam, but what's entailed by that? Like what are the arkan, like what are the pillars of prayer? What are the conditions to be able to pray, and so on and so forth. So that knowledge is something that's religiously required, and it's not like something that requires a lifetime of study. It really, like if you boil it down, it's more like a semester, like a typical college semester or two that you could learn like all of the the knowledge that's you're religiously required to learn. And so I would recommend that people start with that because ultimately your afterlife depends on it, right? It would be a catastrophe if we stand before Allah on Yawm al-Qiyamah and it turns out that we haven't been praying properly, we haven't fasted properly, and these are things that we hope that Allah will forgive our mistakes, the mistakes that we made in ignorance, but there's no excuse for just persisting in ignorance, right? That's not really an excuse that we can give. So I would recommend that people just start with the basics. If they have no prior exposure to Islamic learning, then you don't need to be going into like usul al-fiqh. You don't need to be going into some of these advanced discussions on the attributes of Allah. And that's a mistake that a lot of, the more enthusiastic young Muslims get into, is that they think that, okay, well, if I want to be conversant on this debate that's raging in this, small circle, then I need to, start talking about
Ibn Arabi.
attributes of Allah. Yeah, Ibn Arabi, and get into the, Asma wa Sifat. So I would say that don't fall into that trap. Just go directly to the basics. And there are plenty of online institutes that provide that kind of instruction, and you can take a class.
Would you recommend any?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Seeker's Path is a good online resource, and they offer classes. I'm not affiliated with them, but I know Sheikh Faraz Rabbani just from a long time ago. Met him in Boston and took a couple of workshops with him. But just I followed the development of these courses that he's created and this institute, and I'd recommend that. But there's others as well, and there's no excuse. Like if you have with the internet nowadays, everything is at your fingertips. So there are a lot of institutes that provide like instruction that, okay, these are the fundamentals of faith, and that's the name of the course. And there's no guesswork that's needed. Just you take that, and that will, inshallah, provide you with a foundation. And then if you want to pursue more, ahlan wa sahlan. If not, then at least like you've done what's required of you religiously.
Awesome. Daniel, I had 2 cups of coffee during our deep and enlightening discussion. I really appreciate your thoughts and your responses and your passion. And, may Allah bless all of us in pursuing the truth and what is good and beautiful to the best of our ability. And I'd love to have you back. I think there's a lot of other topics I'd love to explore with you. And thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah, Jazakallah khair. I really enjoyed it. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. And hopefully everybody learned something. And if you have any questions or comments, please visit coffeewithkareem.com. We do love to hear your feedback, inquiries, suggestions. Check out The Muslim Skeptic to learn more about Daniel and his work. He's also pretty active on Facebook and other social media. So give that some time as well. Thanks again, Daniel. And Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam.